So today I wanted to discuss a pretty interesting application of the evolutionary principles that we've been discussing up to this point to a different field of research that is to some extent a little distinct from psychology. However, it's just so interesting. I think it's going to be a welcome detour for pretty much everybody. So I wanted to start today with a common story. It comes up for pretty much every human, and indeed every animal, as far as I've been able to discern, on at least some occasions, which is that you wake up in the morning and you're feeling tired. And while feeling tired is usually pretty normal for most people as they wake up, something about the feeling is more intense today. And as you take your first few breaths in, you notice that your nose feels congested, that there's a minor tickle in your throat. And as the day progresses, you're going to begin to cough a little more than usual. You find your body temperature begins to rise. And placing all these little things together, you've come to realize that you have an infection in your body somewhere. And this infection is causing a series of symptoms, including your low energy, your nasal congestion, a sore throat, a cough, and a fever. So given that this has all taken place, what actions should you take? Should you go and grab some medication to help reduce the symptoms of your illness? Or should you let the symptoms go untreated and run their natural course? If you're going to treat your symptoms, which ones do you intend to treat? When and why should you avoid treating some of the other ones? And indeed, has the question ever really occurred to you that maybe it's not actually a good idea to treat the symptoms that you have in the first place? We also want to think about why are some of these infections relatively benign, while others might be frequently lethal to their hosts. And what might we do on a societal level to help contain and reduce the harm caused by parasites, both in the short and the long term? And as we're going to explore today, the answers to these questions and more can be profitably explored through understanding the complex evolutionary relationships between parasites on the one hand and their hosts on the other. And for those of you who are interested about learning more in this subject, pretty much everything I'm going to discuss today is coming directly from the book The Evolution of Infectious Disease by Paul Ewald. It's a great read and I would highly recommend it. So we should start off with a few key items and ideas to set the stage here. Parasites, most commonly the ones we would think of as viruses and bacteria, are organisms whose life cycle involves infecting a different host organism, reproducing within that host, usually causing the host some amount of biological harm in the process, and the end reproductive goal being both to continue to reproduce within the host and eventually to transmit copies of themselves to other host bodies. And it's vital to emphasize here that the adaptive goal of the parasites, like all life, is simply their own reproduction. They don't derive any adaptive benefits from inflicting costs on their hosts per se, but these costs do tend to arise as a byproduct of the parasite's successful reproduction in the host's body. And as this reproduction often tends to be quite rapid, with many parasites reproducing themselves on a scale of hours or days, compared with humans that reproduce themselves, say, in a matter of decades. The speed at which parasites can reproduce carries several interesting practical implications in terms of guiding what our effective behavioral responses to them should be, and help us guide their evolutionary trajectory actually in real time. Another term we should probably define here is virulence. A parasite's virulence is the degree to which the parasite tends to inflict costs on the host. And the virulence of the parasite interacts with the hosts of resistance, which is the ability to harm and fight off the parasites in turn, such that more resistant hosts tend to be subject to less virulent infections and vice versa. And understanding these key interactions here between parasites and hosts can guide our knowledge about how these interactions might range from mild on one hand, you mightn't even be consciously aware that you're infected, to, on the other hand, being lethal and killing you. So thinking about these interactions between parasites and hosts, specifically the idea that the parasites need host bodies to reproduce inside of, has led to a common perception among many people that over time, parasites should naturally evolve to be less harmful to their hosts. After all, If the parasite is harming their host to the degree that the host dies, so too are all the parasites within that host seemingly confining themselves to death. So as such, if the parasites do too much harm to their host bodies, the parasites should be harming their own reproduction in the process. However, if you take a parasite's view on this perspective here, using the lens of evolution, we can see that this story of evolving towards being benign isn't quite complete, and in many cases might not be accurate at all. And this is because, as we've reviewed many times, evolution is not about survival per se, but more about reproduction. All organisms are going to eventually die, and that includes parasites and hosts alike. A parasite that reproduced only within inside a single host's body will always find the host is going to die eventually. And with the inevitable death of the host goes the genetic line of the parasite. The parasite that's going to continue to successfully reproduce over evolutionary time, by necessity, needs to transmit copies of itself to new hosts. And the ability of a parasite to transmit themselves from body to body is ultimately going to determine the evolutionary course of the parasite, and in turn, the parasite's effect on the hosts that it inhabits. And as we're going to see, so long as parasites are able to transmit themselves readily into other new host bodies, the damage they inflict on the hosts may become severe. So let's return to our opening story. You've woken up and you have an infection. You have a cold, say. You're experiencing some physical symptoms. Should you treat those symptoms? That is, if you treat the symptoms, you might derive some immediate psychological relief by treating them, because you're not congested anymore, you're not coughing, you're not in pain. But will treating those symptoms lead to better outcomes for you in the long term? And the answer, as with many things in life, is it depends. Indeed, as Ewald notes, there's a reason for the popular saying, you're only treating the symptoms of the problem. The thrust of that point is that it may be possible to relieve the discomfort caused by a problem without actually solving the problem itself. So that is, if you're having pain because you've injured yourself physically, you can take pain-reducing medication to block your experience of pain. You can make yourself more physically comfortable, but that medication is not going to heal the physical damage. If anything, the medication might actually make the damage worse. After all, if you've injured your leg and you remove the pain you experience from feeling that injury, the pain is no longer going to be able to effectively guide your behavior to do things like keep you off your leg while it heals properly. And as it is with pain and physical injury, so too is it the case with infections and symptoms. Sometimes treating the symptoms of an infection can be life-saving, while other times treating those same symptoms can be life-threatening, and anything in between. And what I want to think about here more specifically is that the symptoms of the infection, they might be mere byproducts of that infection, but they also might represent adaptations on the part of the parasite that manipulates the host, that is, the parasite manipulating your body to try and improve its own reproductive outcomes at your expense, or the symptoms may represent your bodily defense mechanisms, like the functioning of your immune system, attempting to fight off the infection. So if a symptom is the result of a parasite's adaptations, treating the symptom may harm the ability of the parasite to successfully reproduce, and it might help you fight off the infection in the short term. However, if the symptom itself results from a bodily defense mechanism, treating that symptom can represent a weakening of your ability to successfully fight off a parasite. And knowing the difference between which symptom represents which is pretty vitally important for figuring out the successful treatment of any disease. So to examine an example of this in action, Ewald considers a response that many species generate in response to an infection, which is a fever. That's where your body core temperature rises well above its normal range. In some cases, these fevers represent bodily defense mechanisms against infections. That is, when you have a fever, you are harming the ability of the parasites within your body to successfully reproduce themselves. And then, of course, there are other infections for which fever is actually not effective at fighting them off. Sometimes it's a good defense mechanism, and sometimes it isn't. And in one case he highlights, you can look at iguanas. And iguanas are particularly interesting because since they're lizards, iguanas regulate their body temperature by moving themselves between warmer and cooler external environments. If you've ever seen a lizard basking in the warm sun, that's what it's doing. It's raising its body temperature. And if you were to expose a desert iguana to a specific bacterial infection, you can notice a behavioral defense mechanism that takes part on the part of this iguana, which is that it tends to move itself to warmer climates to upregulate its body temperature, and the iguana is actually going to generate a fever in itself. And if you experimentally infect these iguanas and then prevent them from controlling their temperature, that is, you keep them in an enclosure where they can't warm themselves up as much, given the right infection, you can find this actually severely hampers the ability of the iguana to fight it off. It makes it more susceptible to developing severe infections when you prevent it from generating a fever. So in this case, it seems that these purposefully induced fevers represent a host defense mechanism against the infection. And if you were to treat the fever symptom in this case, you would result in worsening that infection. That is, if you took medication that reduced the severity of your fever. By contrast, there are some malarial infections that can get into some western fence lizards, and this infection apparently is about as good as reproducing itself regardless of whether the lizard is running a fever or not. And accordingly, when that species is infected by this malaria parasite, you notice that it does not generate a fever. It does not purposefully move itself to warmer temperatures because the fever is not an effective defense mechanism against that particular strain. And of course, there's also the degree of the fever to consider. That is another example Ewald talks about, using aspirin to reduce a moderate fever in rabbits. So not an extreme fever, just a moderate fever. Using aspirin to reduce that appeared to harm the survival prospects of the rabbits with a particular bacterial infection. But if the rabbits started generating a very intense fever, reducing that failed to have the same effect. That it was all right to reduce the extreme fever, but it was a worse idea to reduce the modest fever. The degree matters. So as such, while fevers may represent a host defense mechanism against infections, they may not always be effective in that role. And being able to determine whether a fever is an effective defense mechanism against an infection involves a much deeper consideration between the specific host, the specific parasite, and the specific mechanisms through which they interact. However, conducting that research, or more practically, in deciding whether you want to medicate to reduce a fever, it's important to have this question in the back of your mind as to, am I thinking of this fever as a defense mechanism or not? If this fever is actually defending me against the infection, maybe I don't want to take medication to reduce it. And treating it might actually make your symptoms worse. So you got to be careful of how you medicate. And this general logic extends out to any other symptom that's associated with any infections. In our example here, you woke up experiencing fatigue, pain, a cough, congestion, and a fever. Some of the medications you might take for these are going to treat multiple symptoms at the same time. You might see a medication that says, treats 7 symptoms of the common cold. And each time you're treating one of those symptoms, what you're doing is you're representing a chance that you may make your infection worse, or you may make your infection better. Moreover, each of those symptoms might represent something different. Some might be parasitic manipulation, while others might be your own defense mechanisms against the infection. We've already considered the fever, but let's look at the others now and think about how they might represent different cases. So let's say you wanted to treat the symptoms of fatigue. You're feeling tired and you treat these symptoms by, say, ingesting caffeine. Or you're experiencing physical pain, and so you take a pain reliever. When you do this, when you reduce your pain and you reduce your fatigue, you're probably going to become more physically active because you're not feeling bad anymore. Is that good or bad for the infection? And again, that depends. If the fatigue and the pain is discouraging you from taking actions, and discouraging you from taking actions functions to conserve your body's energetic resources so it can divert those towards an immune response, making yourself feel well enough to become physically active again can redivert that energy away from your immune system and to your muscles, which can result in your infection possibly getting worse. So the fatigue and pain here might actually be representing bodily defense mechanisms, or resource allocation mechanisms more precisely. However, the fatigue can also represent a parasitic manipulation of its host to prevent the host from moving around, which is actually relevant to the spread of some infections that we're going to get to later. Or maybe the fatigue is just a byproduct of cellular damage that's occurring as the result of the infection. And in the latter cases, if it's just a byproduct or if it's active manipulation by the parasite, treating the pain or the fatigue might be fine as far as you're concerned. You just need to know which is which. If you were to treat your nasal congestion, typically through medications that reduce inflammation, you might gain some relief in your ability to comfortably breathe. However, by reducing inflammation, you may also be removing concentrations of immune system response from the site of the infection. When you're infected, tissues tend to swell up. And this is part of an immune response, a bodily defense mechanism. And if you reduce this inflammation, you may now readily allow the infected tissue to start infecting its neighbors. It was previously being controlled by this inflammation. You reduce the inflammation, and you open up the floodgates for it to start infecting neighboring cells and make the infection worse. So this could just prolong your infection or make it more severe. And also by treating your cough, you might be relieving some discomfort, but you may also be shutting down a bodily defense mechanism that's attempting to physically expel parasites and infected tissue from your airway. If you stop coughing, what you do is you keep that infected tissue and you keep those parasites contained within your body more regularly, and this can expose you to more of the pathogens and worsen your infection. However, infections also, as we mentioned, need to spread from host to host. And in that light, it's also plausible to suggest that a cough might be triggered by an infection as a means of manipulating its host to spread it to other people. And so if the cough is actually representing a manipulative parasitic adaptation here, treating it might be appropriate to prevent other people in your general vicinity from getting sick without necessarily worsening your own infection. So how do you tell the difference between adaptations for host defense, parasitic manipulation, or byproducts of the infection? Now, the bad news here for us, for you and I, for anyone who's listening, is that any individual person probably can't tell the difference very well. Without rigorous study, there doesn't appear to be any intuitively plausible ways to determine which symptom represents what. Is it parasite manipulation? Is it a host defense? Is it a byproduct? It's hard for any of us to know without studying it. So there are going to be many times you're going to get sick, and you're not going to be able to tell whether treating your symptoms is going to make you better or worse. However, empirically, there are ways that we can address this issue, as we saw with the case of fever. That is, the experimental method for determining whether a symptom is a defense mechanism, a manipulation, or a byproduct is fairly simple at the heart of the matter. What you do is you treat the symptom and you observe the outcome of reducing that symptom. If you remove the symptom and the infections tend to get worse and more severe, as measured through factors like how long does the infection last, how much bodily damage does the organism suffer, or how often does it die from the infection. If you see that the infections tend to get worse, they last longer, they cause more damage, and they kill more of their hosts, that probably means the symptom that you were treating was a host defense mechanism. By getting rid of it, you make the infection worse. By contrast, if you treat the symptom and the infection gets better, that symptom probably represents host manipulation by the parasite. And if treating a symptom doesn't really reduce in either outcome, it doesn't make the infection worse, but it doesn't make the infection better, then it's probably just a byproduct of the fact that infections cause bodily damage, and this bodily damage is associated with certain symptoms. So for some examples of this, we can first think about cholera, and this is about the closest thing I could find to demonstrate cholera, which is a diarrheal disease resulting from a bacterial infection. When a person's infected by the cholera bacteria, the infection hijacks the host's body. It basically plants itself in your intestines and releases a toxin, and this toxin causes liquids to flood into the digestive tract, resulting in diarrhea. And this parasitic manipulation serves a dual role, which is that first, it flushes out the competing bacterial species that live in our guts, making it more likely to reproduce, as well as providing a means through which the cholera bacteria is going to ultimately spread to its new hosts. It's going to spread through that diarrhea. Now, the loss of bodily fluids resulting from this infection can sometimes prove fatal for the hosts, and treating the symptoms of dehydration through rehydration therapy can really prevent a lot of deaths from this infection. Relatedly, if you treat the diarrhea itself through medication, you can also not only prevent some of this bodily harm that's caused by the dehydration, but you can also actively prevent the ability of the parasite to transmit itself to a new host by cutting down on the means through which it exits your body. So in such cases, like in cholera, the symptomatic treatment can prove invaluable. It can save people's lives and it can prevent the spread of the infection, which is demonstrating here that some of the symptoms are indeed the result of the host manipulation by the parasite. And Ewald also considers another related case of dysentery, which is a bloody diarrhea brought on by an infection of the digestive tract. And in this case, one bacterial infection that causes dysentery is made worse. The infection gets worse if you treat the diarrhea. And this is because sometimes this diarrheal response can represent a case of a host defense against the infection, attempting to physically flush out the parasites, much like coughing, as we discussed. And we can understand that's the case because medicating the symptoms of diarrhea here seems to make this particular bacterial infection worse, as measured by people staying sick longer than untreated patients. However, in that case, it's possible that diarrhea can actually serve a dual role as well. So it might also be the case that not only is it bad, it's good for the host if it can flush out the bacteria, but it's also good for the bacteria because the bacteria wants to be flushed out because that's how it's going to make its way into more bodies. In this case, it's plausible the symptom actually has a dual role, where it's both a representation of the host's defense and in a manipulation by the parasite. They both agree on what the correct course of action for the host should be. And again, coughing may be another example of this. It might be good if you cough because it clears out respiratory infectious tissues, so it's good for your body, but it's also potentially good for the parasite because when you cough, you increase the chances that it makes its way into other bodies. So in both cases here, if you treat either the cough or the diarrhea, you might actually end up making the infection worse because you're increasing the amount of parasites present in the body. So in cases like these, when both the host and the parasite metaphorically, evolutionarily agree as to what the best course of action is, there's a pretty stable pressure maintaining those symptoms in the population, and you should expect those to persist over time because it's good for the host to get the bacteria out, and it's good for the bacteria to get out of the body into new bodies. We should expect that to persist over time. However, if you consider a case like a cough or diarrhea, where treating the symptoms might be bad for the parasite in question, this can really influence our thinking about what policies we want to enact on a societal level. That is, let's say in the case of dysentery, if you treat the diarrhea in the case of dysentery, it's worse for the host because the host is going to have a worse infection. But if you don't treat it, you're going to increase the probability that the dysentery actually transfers itself to another host. And this is a benefit-cost ratio that really has to be considered when you think about whether or not you want to treat a symptom. there may be ways of treating symptoms that are better for the host but worse for society, and vice versa, ways that are better for society but worse for the person with the infection. And there may also be ways of treating symptoms successfully while avoiding the costs of infecting more individuals successfully. But crucially, you need to decide what is the function of this symptom before you start thinking about whether or how to treat it in the first place. And this consideration of trade-offs between how we might treat symptoms in a host to prevent transmission to others brings us to the next point that Ewald considers, which is the matter of parasite virulence, which again, as we covered, is the amount of damage that an infection does to the host. Now, as we mentioned before, a host dying is usually not a good thing for the parasites living inside of it, because with the death of the host, that usually means the death of the parasites in very short order. As dead parasites tend to be worse at reproducing themselves than living ones, we might then expect that parasites do have something of a vested evolutionary interest in not killing their host. However, as we know on this ultimate level of analysis, what matters in evolution is reproduction, not life or death per se. Death is going to be a constant for both the host and the parasites living within it, and what really matters is how well that parasite is able to reproduce itself before its death or the death of its host. And in that regard, it becomes clear that there's no natural law suggesting parasites are going to naturally evolve towards not killing their hosts. Not that they're going to try to. Parasites are not trying to kill their hosts. But rather, if the parasites that are infecting a host engage in rather aggressive behaviors when it comes to reproducing themselves, when they take a lot of the host's resources to reproduce themselves, this does tend to result in the death of the host more than a parasite that takes less. And if a parasite that's taking more from the host is better at reproducing itself and getting itself into other bodies, there's going to be a selection pressure for those variants that are more virulent and away from the variants that are less virulent. In practical terms, we know that some parasites are far more likely to kill the host than others are. Everyone out here probably has gotten a cold, and almost everyone that gets a cold is going to recover from this cold without dying. By contrast, what you see here is a case of a smallpox infection. And when people get infected by smallpox, which according to the World Health Organization is about fatal in 30% of the infections, we can really appreciate the difference between a cold that almost everyone recovers from and smallpox that's going to kill about 30% of the infected people. So what I want to think about here is, what are the evolutionary pressures that can push a parasite along the spectrum from merely inconvenient to a host to downright lethal to it? And one critical factor appears to be the means through which the parasite spreads to a new host. So in the case of a common cold in humans, they spread through what tends to be person-to-person contact. A person with a cold might cough or sneeze, sending parasites into the air that get inhaled by other people. Or you might get some mucus or infected tissue on your hands and touch someone or touch a surface. Or in some way infect someone else through relatively direct contact with them. Now, what's important to note in this case is that person-to-person transmission requires that the infected individual is moving around from place to place and physically contacting new hosts. So in this case, if the parasite is so damaging, so virulent to the host, that the host is unable to freely move around their environment anymore, the probability of successful person-to-person transmission declines rapidly. And without successful transmission into new hosts, any infection that immobilizes or kills too readily would end its own genetic line. However, there are cases where parasites are transmitted by a vector. And a vector in this case is another living organism that spreads an infection. And when a parasite's transmitted by a vector, it doesn't require its host to be moving around too much, and in some cases might actively benefit from disabling its host to enhance its own transmission. So when the vector of a parasite is, say, a mosquito bite, where the mosquito is going to land on a person, drink some blood, pick up a parasite from that person's blood, and then subsequently transfer it to the next host that it feeds from. The biological equivalent, effectively, of people sharing a needle. The parasite doesn't require that its host be mobile in order to spread, because the mosquito, the vector, is providing that mobility for it. In fact, it might actually benefit the host that's being spread by a vector. It might benefit the parasite that's being spread by a vector if the host is disabled. Because if you are completely fatigued and disabled from the infection, well, guess what? You're much less likely to be able to successfully fend off mosquito bites. So the parasite may also begin to reproduce inside of the body more aggressively, not just to disable the host, but to get more copies of itself into the bloodstream that the mosquitoes are going to feed from, so it has an increased chance of getting into a new body. And indeed, according to Ewald's own analysis that he's conducted, the parasites that transmit themselves primarily from human to human through a vector of a biting insect, like a mosquito, these tend to be substantially more virulent than the ones that transmit from person-to-person contact, at least as measured by their probability to kill the people that they infect. That is, the more vector-borne an infection is, the more damage it tends to do to the body, all things considered. And this raises some further matters worth considering. The first of these concerns the evolutionary relationship between different parasites within the same host. So all parasites within a host, whether they're very virulent or whether they're not very virulent, high or low, are going to die if the host dies. And this means that the state of affairs should create a conflict between different parasites at times, where some parasites might actively work to suppress others as a means of monopolizing the host's resources, and perhaps in some cases even preventing harm to the host's body, because a particularly virulent infection is going to kill off other parasites if the host dies, and so these other parasites sometimes might be expected to actively fight against other infectious agents. However, there's another more harmful state of affairs that can result from this conflict. Specifically, if you think about a host that has multiple parasites, they have 2 or 3 or more different infections at the same time, and one or some combination of them is likely to induce severe harm or death, the more virulent parasites, those that are doing the most damage to the host body by most aggressively reproducing themselves, these tend to have the selective advantage in the case of multiple infections. That's because if the host is likely to die soon, the parasites that gain the greatest adaptive advantage are the ones that are reproducing most aggressively, because they're using the most resources in this very time-limited fashion they have them relative to other infections, and they also have the greatest degree of hopping from host to host because they're reproducing themselves most aggressively. And this raises the distinct possibility that the contexts that create multiple infections within hosts also may end up creating evolutionary pressures towards more virulence among parasites. If you get a lot of infections at about the same time, if this is consistent, this can create a situation where the most virulent, most aggressively reproducing parasites are the ones that end up getting favored. And indeed, Ewald notes this pattern among different types of malaria, which is a vector-borne disease spread by mosquitoes. The most virulent types of malaria are the ones that tend to occur in the presence of other simultaneous infections. So when multiple infections are present in populations over time, this can favor the more aggressively reproducing virulent strains. So what this previous analysis here would suggest then is that any factor that facilitates transmission rates should also increase virulence. That is, the better a parasite is at getting from host to host, the more rapidly it can do this, the more often it can do this, the fewer costs the parasite tends to endure from harming or even killing its host. And instead it starts gaining a lot of benefits from enhanced rates of reproduction. So again, with respect to different types of malaria-causing parasites, Ewald notes that the most virulent of these The most damaging types of malaria tend to be the ones that are spread in geographic locations where mosquitoes are alive for a greater portion of the year. If mosquitoes aren't going to be alive for a long time, if they're going to be lacking in an environment, such as, say, during cold winter months, any parasite that had to transfer through this mosquito that killed its host too quickly would quickly be selected out of the population, because it would be unable to survive and spread itself later as the mosquito population through which it spread declined. If it killed its host too fast, to the point there are no more mosquitoes to spread it because the cold temperature comes, there goes the end of the malaria. So as such, when continuous transmission throughout the year is not possible, some parasitic infections instead become less virulent and can lay dormant inside of a host for months, only emerging again as a full-blown infection once transmission becomes possible. Similarly, we should expect that the population density of susceptible hosts is also going to affect the tendency of parasites to become more or less virulent. If population density is very high and there are lots of susceptible hosts in the area, it becomes easier for a parasite to move from host to host. This enhances its transmission rate. And the more you enhance the transmission rate, the more virulent virus you are selecting for, or bacteria, or any type of parasite for that matter. By contrast, if you have a low population density, and the parasite only has an opportunity to jump from host to host infrequently, any type of premature disabling or killing of the host should prove maladaptive and ultimately be selected against. So in that respect, Ewald mentions another very interesting example of slow rates of transmission that result in less virulent parasites. Specifically, if a parasite can be transmitted between a parent and an offspring when reproduction takes place, this is referred to as vertical transmission because it goes from parent down to offspring. A parasite that can reproduce from a parent into an offspring tends to have a reduced tendency to harm the host. And this makes sense because if you kill a parent, you can prevent it from reproducing, and accordingly you can prevent the parasite from being spread to other bodies. By contrast, the more parasites spread from host to host in a more immediate sense, that is between one living adult and another living adult, what you would call horizontal transmission from person to person that way, these tend to have an increased tendency to become more virulent because harming the host carries less costs for reproduction. So I wanted to stick with these vector-borne parasites for a moment, those that spread horizontally from human host to human host, in this case through, let's say, mosquito bites, and examine an example of just how interesting the parasitic manipulation of hosts might actually be, and how interestingly the parasites may also manipulate the vectors that spread them. And we're going to use a case of malaria here. So I want to start with an infected host. This is someone who already has a malarial infection that can be transmitted to other people. There are parasites within the host's body that need to transmit themselves to a different host. This means those parasites in your body must reach a vector, in this case a mosquito. They need to get into the mosquito's body. To do that, the mosquito needs to locate the host that's infected, needs to land on it, avoid detection and defense against it by the host, like you don't want to swat and kill the mosquito, and then it has to locate and drink from the infected blood to pick up the infection itself. So when mosquitoes feed, they achieve this by using a proboscis, effectively a long mouth feeding tube that pierces into the skin and probes the host, looking for the bloodstream so it can drink from it. However, this process takes time. The mosquito doesn't just land on you and immediately start feeding. It has to locate the blood vessel and it has to feed. And so they might not locate the blood vessel immediately. They might not get blood from it as fast on each successive poke. It takes time for the mosquito to start feeding. But the longer the mosquito lingers on the host's body, the greater the risks it entails. It might get swatted, it might get shooed off. So the mosquito wants to drink from you pretty fast. Now, as we've already covered, the malaria infections can aid the mosquito in this to some extent by disabling the host. If the host is very physically worn down by a very damaging infection, it's less able to defend itself against mosquito bites. But the manipulation by malaria doesn't stop there. That is, there's some evidence that if you're infected with malaria, you may actually become a more attractive feeding target for mosquitoes in some capacity. That is, I came across a 2005 paper by researchers LaCrue et al. Entitled Malarial Infection Increases Attractiveness of Humans to Mosquitoes. And what the researchers did in this paper is they examined 3 different groups of human children in Africa. They had children that were uninfected by malaria, children infected by malaria during a non-infectious stage of the disease, and children that were infected with malaria that was capable of being transmitted to other humans through mosquitoes. So they basically put these 3 types of people into 3 different rooms connected by a central tube, and into that tube they released mosquitoes. And when the mosquitoes were given free access to these children, they tended to feed primarily from the children infected with the transmissible form of the infection. That is, when children were capable of transmitting the infection, the mosquitoes were preferentially feeding from them compared to either uninfected children or children that were infected but not currently capable of transmitting. The mosquitoes were about twice as likely to feed from those children that could actually pass the infection along when given the opportunity. However, this went away once the children were successfully treated for their malaria. Once the infectious form was treated, the mosquitoes were no longer preferring the children they previously did. And so this suggests something about the malarial infection, when it's transmittable, is actually making its host appear like a more desirable feeding target for its vectors. And by doing so, it can increase the chances it makes it into that vector, and that vector is going to make it to someone else. But the infection also appears to change the quality of the blood itself, to help reduce the amount of time an insect, in this case a mosquito, needs to spend time feeding. This is from an earlier paper, 1985, by Rossignol et al., entitled Enhanced Mosquito Blood Finding Success on Parasitemic Hosts, Evidence for Vector Parasite Mutualism. And in this paper, the researchers uncovered that when mosquitoes were feeding from control healthy laboratory mice, it took them about 147 seconds total to feed. The mosquito has to land on it, probe around till it finds the bloodstream, drink, and then leave. It took about 145 seconds to do that. By contrast, when these mice had been experimentally infected by malaria, it only took the mosquitoes about 71 seconds to do the same thing. It was about half the time when the mice were infected by malaria. That is, mosquitoes were able to more readily feed and leave their infected hosts, suggesting that there is some host manipulation by the malaria parasites here to assist in its own vector-borne transmission. And as the researchers of this paper also note, many vector-borne parasites that spread in this manner, that is, things that spread from insects biting one host and then biting another host, they transfer via blood. A lot of these tend to also cause problems in the host's body, effectively relating to their ability to coagulate their blood to form a clot. The organisms that are infected tend to be a lot worse at generating clots. They have bleeding problems, basically. And with bleeding problems, this enhances the ability of the infection to spread itself because it's making its hosts bleed more readily and getting that blood into the vectors that it needs to transmit itself. So at this point, we see that the host can be disabled by a malaria infection, making it less likely to fight off mosquitoes. Mosquitoes can be preferentially drawn towards the host with the infection, and they're more readily able to feed from that host when they land on it. So now, if you're the parasite, once you're inside the mosquito. Once the mosquito is carrying the infection, the parasite would, metaphorically, prefer that the mosquito feed from another host that it can be readily transmitted to, which opens the door for the parasite to start manipulating the vector spreading it. And as it turns out, there's also evidence that happens. In this case, you have a 1998 paper by Coella et al. Entitled The Malarial Parasite. I'm going to mess this translation up, but let's see. Plasmodium falciparum. The malarial parasite increases the frequency of multiple feedings of its mosquito vector. And what this paper found is that in a naturalistic setting, mosquitoes that were carrying a malarial parasite tended to both drink more blood from their hosts, suggesting they spent longer times feeding from them, and they also tended to feed from more hosts, as measured by the amount of blood from different hosts they had inside of it. That is, specifically here, 22% of mosquitoes carrying the malaria infection had blood from 2 or more hosts in them, compared with only 10% of uninfected mosquitoes. And they also cite some additional research in this paper suggesting that mosquitoes infected with malaria actually have more difficult times subsequently feeding from hosts. In other words, when the mosquito lands on the first host, the mosquito has no infection. It has an easier time feeding from an infected host. But once the mosquito has an infection, it becomes much more difficult from this mosquito to feed, which encourages the mosquito to stay in hosts longer, to keep poking around in there, and to spend more time in its bloodstream to enhance the transmission. In practical terms here, it means that mosquitoes infected by malaria appear to bite people more often and for longer periods of time, which should all be spreading the parasite more effectively. And so taken together here, we have a case of a malarial infection that appears to be making its host less able to fight off vectors, more attractive to those vectors, eases the process of those vectors feeding from them, and once the parasite is inside the vector, it makes subsequent feeding more difficult because it's better for the parasite if the mosquito spreads the parasite to other hosts through longer feeding periods and drinking from more possible hosts and drinking more blood when it does, even if this is going to ultimately increase the odds the mosquito is killed. Because from the parasite's point of view, as long as the mosquito is helping it get into other bodies, it doesn't care as much if the mosquito ultimately is more likely to die. So, with this idea of how vectors, living organisms that spread parasites, can create this selection pressure that results in more virulent parasites, it's equally important to attend to the contexts of life that can create vector-like contexts for parasites to spread through. That is, while vectors can definitely aid in the spread of a more virulent infection, there are features of the world that act like vectors despite not necessarily maintaining that same relationship. And one of them happens to be this relationship between predators and prey. Specifically, when a predator eats a prey organism, the predator is ingesting not just whatever useful nutrients it can extract from the prey's body, but it's also ingesting all the parasites that happen to be inside the prey as well. As anyone who has ever ingested spoiled food and suffered food poisoning can affirm here, the risks of infection through food are real and substantial. In the case of parasites that spread from the ingestion of prey by a predator, you can also encourage some very virulent parasites to emerge. And the logic underlying this here is very simple, which is that if a parasite intends to spread from one body to another host, when the host eats the prey that the parasite is currently living in, whatever harm the parasite is doing to the prey can potentially be irrelevant because the prey's body is going to be destroyed anyway, or it might even be a positive. That is, if the prey is going to be eaten and destroyed anyway, its current host is going to die for the parasite to continue to spread. The parasite that damages the prey the most makes the prey the weakest and that prey now has a much harder time avoiding predators. So in this case, damaging the prey might be good not just because the parasite is increasing its own reproduction more, but it's also making it more likely to be caught and eaten by the predators it's ultimately trying to spread to. Again, if you've ever been sick and you've tried to attempt a physical workout, something strenuous, or perhaps, depending on how sick you are, even do something as simple as taking a short walk, you can really appreciate how much easier a predator's life becomes if the prey that it's trying to kill is carrying a pretty severe infection. And Ewald here highlights a very classic example of this relationship that some of you might be aware of, but just in case you're not familiar with it, there's a parasitic worm that part of its life cycle involves getting into an ant, infecting an ant, and then that ant has to be eaten by a sheep. The parasite is trying to go from ant to sheep. And it achieves this through the sheeps eating the ants as the sheeps are grazing. It's a type of predator-prey relationship in a rather unintentional way. So because the ant's body is going to be destroyed when the sheep consumes it, it happens to be adaptive for the worm to get this to happen. And the worm appears to actively manipulate the behavior of the ants to achieve this goal. Specifically, this parasitic worm seems to rewire the ant's brain in a way that causes these ants to climb up blades of grass, bite into the tips of them with their jaws and lock in, and just dangle off the edges of the tips of the blades of grass. Because this is going to increase the probability that the ant is subsequently eaten by a passing sheep that's grazing. And then when the parasite gets inside the sheep, it reproduces there and ultimately passes out through the sheep's droppings, which are then consumed by the ants, and the cycle of transmission continues to repeat itself. But the larger point here is that because the parasite intends to transmit itself from an ant to a sheep through the means of this ant being consumed, you get a very virulent parasite that regularly results in the death of its host, because the death of the host here is not only irrelevant, but desirable. The means through which the parasites transmit themselves can result in greater or reduced harm to its hosts. And on that note, there's another factor that appears to contribute to the virulence of parasites, which is their ability to, as Ewald puts it, sit and wait. Or more specifically, in more technical terms, the ability of a parasite to survive in an external environment outside of a host for a very long time. So it is, if you have a parasite that isn't transferred by a vector, it's not going from person to person through mosquito bites, and is very short-lived outside of the body, that it's not very good at living on a surface. It might last out there for a couple seconds to a couple hours. Say you cough and the parasite lands on your table. It doesn't have a very long expected lifespan on the table. Then this parasite can't really afford to be virulent. That's because, as we reviewed, if it can't live in the outside world and it's not being transmitted by a vector, it needs its host wandering around the world to find new hosts to infect. It can't debilitate the host to survive. So, what happens if you have a non-vector-borne parasite that can survive on a surface for longer? Presumably, the longer that this parasite can survive outside of a host, the fewer costs it's going to pay if it debilitates or kills that host. Because it doesn't require a living host for successful transmission. It can just sit and wait on a surface for a long time until another host comes around. And when he analyzed data bearing on this prediction, Ewald found just that. The longer parasites can live outside of a host, the more virulent they tend to be. And in his example, a respiratory parasite, something that maybe causes a common cold. This can live outside of a human body for a few hours or a few days. And these tend to kill about 1 to 10 people for every 100,000 they infect. Very low virulence rate as measured by death of host. Smallpox, by contrast, can survive outside the body for decades. and accordingly tends to kill about 10% of the people it infects. So if you have a respiratory parasite that can't really live outside of a host, and it's killing 1 to 10 people per 10,000, the smallpox that can survive potentially for decades in the outside environment is killing 10,000 people per 100,000 infected. Massive difference. The more effectively a parasite can sit and wait for a new host, the less it requires a living host for successful transmission, and the more harmful it is allowed to be in terms of selection pressures. So now we thought about different forms of transmission here. We have host to host, we have vector to host, we have prey to parasite, and we have sit and wait strategies. There's another context in the world that we can add to this list, which Ewald highlights as a method of helping physically move parasites from one host to another, and that's through waterborne transmission. Specifically, he mentions that many infections that cause diarrhea in the host tend to be a particular virulent killer as far as infections go. Diarrheal diseases tend to be rather bad for bodies. And if you've been following the analysis so far, you should be able to predict why. But it hinges on how infections that cause diarrhea effectively spread themselves from host to host through water. And because transmitting yourself through water doesn't require a particularly mobile host, the parasites can benefit by reproducing aggressively inside the host's body and get as many copies of themselves into the water through that diarrhea as possible, which increase the chances they subsequently find a new host and infect them. And you can think about this in a case of humans, which is that if you've had an infection and you've had diarrhea, you can pump out massive quantities of parasites through that into lakes, rivers, toilets, sewage systems, or be left behind on clothing or bedding that is subsequently washed by people in those same locations. And when the water comes into contact with new hosts that are drinking in it or bathing in it, this opens up the possibility to infect new hosts that actually never came into contact with the original infected individual. And unsurprisingly, as Ewald documents here, the more often a parasite tends to be spread through the water, the more virulent infections with it tend to be. And this is doubly so the case when these infections are spread in relatively densely populated areas that share the same infected water source, because now you have many new susceptible hosts that are all drinking from this common water supply, and all it takes is one particularly virulently infected individual to taint that supply and expose dozens or hundreds or thousands of people to the same infection, who then in turn recontaminate the water supply and so on. And so if you want to put a lot of these pieces together, you can imagine the following scenario that really might favor virulent infections and create so many contexts that these selection pressures kind of peak. They make the most virulent infections you can imagine. That is, what you want is a relatively high density of hosts of these infections that gather in one location, a lot of people, a lot of susceptibles in one location, and that the population of hosts would be comprised of those perhaps with the most virulent forms of these infections. Because those people with the most virulent infections end up staying in this one densely populated area for as long as possible. This could also yield other hosts that arrive that have immune-compromised issues because they're already fighting off an infection, or they could acquire multiple infections in that same location, which again pushes towards increased virulence. And even if these hosts are disabled by their infections, there are still many vectors or vector-like methods of transmission that can get a parasite from a disabled host to another host to reinfect them, even if someone's not moving around physically. And what I've described here is effectively a hospital. These are locations where sick individuals tend to gather. Those who have the worst infections tend to be there for the longest amount of time because they need the most continuous care. They tend to arrive in worse conditions than normal people because the people who are sick and go to a hospital tend to have the worst cases of these infections. Otherwise, people might just stay home and recover on their own with a little bit of bed rest. And even in these hospitals, when patients are confined to their beds because they are so sick because of the damage being done by these infections, doctors and nurses are regularly moving between patients and contacting them physically, which create vector-like conditions under which a parasite can transfer from one infected individual to another, regardless of whether the attendant becomes sick or not. All he needs is some germ on his hand, and he goes from one room to the next. He can deposit them on a new susceptible host. And as the conditions in these locations tend to be prime breeding grounds for selective pressures of increased virulence in infections, as well as cross-infections, extensive measures need to be taken at these hospitals to effectively combat a near-perfect storm that encourages parasite transfer. And indeed, as Ewald notes, there appears to be some evidence that suggests a connection between how long an infection has persisted at a hospital and its eventual lethality. Specifically, the longer an infection remains in a hospital infecting new hosts, the much more virulent they tend to become. And further, many hospital-acquired strains of infections appear particularly damaging compared to those same infections that were acquired from a community setting. That is, infections acquired within a hospital tend to kill and harm a lot more people than infections acquired outside the hospital, even if it's nominally the same type of infection. Now, on the topic of attendant-borne transmission, doctors and nurses bringing infections to people, Ewald recounts an old and famous story from the 1800s where there's this Hungarian physician, and his name is Ignaz Semmelweis. And what he's attempting to do is reduce a rather staggering mortality rate among women giving birth at the clinic he happens to work at. Apparently, from the accounts I've read about this, women at the time understood that the risks of giving birth at that clinic were so great to the point that many of them would prefer to just give birth on the street rather than go to the clinic and be seen by doctors, owing to not wanting them or their newborn children to die. That's how bad the death rate was. So in doing so, in trying to reduce this mortality rate, he noticed that there were two clinics in the same general location that had much different mortality rates. In one of them, the women that were giving birth were attended to by doctors and medical students, and in the other clinic, they were attended to by midwives, not doctors or graduate students. And these two clinics differed dramatically in their mortality rate. But the surprising part was, it was the clinics where the doctors and the medical students were looking after the women giving birth that tended to have them dying at far, far higher rates. Specifically, the numbers that were cited here is about 12% of mothers that gave birth at that clinic with the doctors were dying, compared to about 4% dying when they were attended to by midwives. 12% versus 4%. So why were people more likely to die when they were being attended to by doctors and medical students? Well, as it turns out, one of the activities at the clinic where the doctors and medical students worked involved training medical students by dissecting cadavers. And it would seem this dissection was a pretty popular activity the doctors were engaging in before they went to attend to the women giving birth. So what Ignaz guessed then is that the doctors and medical students were carrying infections to the mothers somehow, following their interactions with the dead bodies, and then going to examine the mothers afterwards. And the midwives weren't doing this, and this is why the death rate was so different. And I say he guessed that this was the case because at the time the germ theory of disease had not really become widely accepted. He just guessed that there was something about the doctors interacting with dead bodies that might be poisoning the mothers, such as carrying some particles from the dead body to the mother. He didn't know exactly what was causing it. This was a guess on his part. And towards remedying this issue, what he did is he implemented a chlorine hand-washing policy. And the reason he did this is that the chlorine solution was the best available option for getting rid of the smell that often accompanied dissection. Again, he didn't know it was caused by bacteria, but he thought the chlorine wash got rid of the smell of touching a dead body the best. And this was a really new idea at the time, that you're going to wash your hands. And following this intervention, mortality dropped at the clinic substantially. I've seen a couple different varying estimates by how much, but the numbers cited by Ewald said it fell from 12% to 3%. There was a paper by Adamet and colleagues that mentioned a drop from 18% to 2%, but regardless of the exact numbers, it was a very, very substantial drop when the doctors and medical students started washing their hands after touching a corpse and before touching a mother that was giving birth. Hand washing was a dramatic improvement. And so you might think that this was a success story, because it is a success story. It's a great success story. However, humans are social creatures. And here you have a case of a physician telling people that doctors and medical students in these hospitals that were attending them were making people sick. The doctors were making people sick, and their hands are unclean. That's effectively his suggestion. As you might expect, the doctors and medical students at these institutions did not like that suggestion. And that carries some reputational costs. No one wants to be known as a doctor that's harming or killing their patients. Accordingly, Ignace ended up being ostracized by his peers. He had to move institutions. Later in life, perhaps owing to the stress of all this, he suffered a nervous breakdown, was committed to a mental asylum, and, in a rather ironic turn of events, eventually died of an infection in that institution that he spent his whole life trying to prevent. And also, the clinic where he was working at originally, as far as I've been able to tell, may have done away with the hand-washing procedure because they thought it was silly and they didn't want to be known as the doctors that were harming their patients, and they brushed it off as nonsense, with predictable results of mortality subsequently increasing. So taking all of this previous analysis together here, we come to the understanding that the means through which parasites spread can heavily determine how harmful they become over time. And this is relevant information because these parasites often reproduce at such a rapid pace that you can actually observe evolutionary selection happening in real time. And we can see a visual example here. This is taken from a video called The Evolution of Bacteria on a Megaplate Petri Dish. And what they did here is you can observe the evolution of antibiotic resistance. There's, you have this really large petri dish, and bacteria is allowed to grow on it. But there are some bands within this petri dish where first there's no antibiotic, then there is a band of this agar with an antibiotic that's the lethal dose for the bacteria. Then there's a band of 10 times the lethal dose of antibiotic, then 100 times, and then in the middle, 1,000 times the lethal dose. So left to grow in this giant petri dish, the bacteria can evolve a resistance to even 1,000 times the lethal dose of antibiotics within a very short time period. In this case, I think about 2 weeks. And the different mutations that allow this to take place are charted in different colors here. The dark blue are bacterial strains in the 0 antibiotic condition. The light blue are in the lethal dose range. The light green are in the 10 times. Then the light yellow in the 100. And then the red and orange in 1,000. You can chart the evolution of antibiotic resistance this way. And given the relatively rapid rate of evolutionary change for many of these parasites, we're going to be fighting a perpetually uphill battle against them when it comes to developing new drugs and vaccines that destroy or disable the infections. Indeed, the more broadly we tend to use antibiotics, the less effective we should expect them to become, because the parasites begin to evolve defenses very rapidly to these chemicals. And this underscores the point that we mentioned earlier, which is that action taken on the part of living organisms can have direct and immediate impacts on the evolutionary trajectories of these parasites and the harm they cause. Through our behavior, whether we're aware of it or not, we can exert long-term control over the virulence of parasites for better or worse. We can make them do more harm to us, or we can make them do less harm to us. So if we do things like increase the density of human populations, we increase the opportunities for parasites to spread, and we can increase their virulence. By cutting down on possible vectors of transmission, or things like act like them, such as by utilizing clean needles to administer intravenous drugs, or sanitize and protecting sources of drinking water, we can create selection pressures that reduce the long-term virulence of parasites by making it harder for them to get into hosts, and therefore make them less likely to damage the hosts so they can survive for longer and find new hosts to spread to. And the same logic is going to hold for a variety of other cultural practices as well, such as how parasites can spread during farming, whether we're farming plants or animals, and how conditions during wartime can work to facilitate subsequent pandemic-level infections, and how we might be able to respond to those outbreaks that do occur. Any behaviors or contexts that are capable of enhancing transmission are going to end up favoring the parasites that do more damage to their host through aggressive reproduction. And indeed, caution is also warranted when it comes to treating the symptoms of these infections, because some of those symptoms are going to be helping us recover, while others are going to be helping the parasite's reproductive goals, and you need to determine which is which to act effectively. And since our behavior guides the virulence of these parasites, whether we appreciate it or not, we might as well develop a better sense for guiding it in the directions we would prefer.